Sweating is, like I said, the body's natural process to control that. And we're going to kind of go through what can happen when the body becomes overloaded. And that's when you potentially could experience some heat-related illnesses. So there's been a lot of research in the past 10 to 20 years that has really looked into what heat does to the body. Specifically, the CDC has guidelines and just some FAQs on what to expect and who is more predisposed to experiencing a heat-related illness. Some of these can include old age, youth, such as infants to 4 years old, people with pre-existing conditions such as heart diseases, obesity, and recent illnesses that have fevers of over 100.4. Because of these, the body isn't able to regulate itself correctly, and that's when some of these symptoms that we'll get into can happen. So talking about some of the other studies that have been done in the past decade, they've really focused on gender differences and what that means with heat intolerance. Most of these studies have been done with militaries. These specifically, the one on the bottom was done with the Israeli Defense Forces. And what they found was that women are typically at a higher risk for heat intolerance. So being outside, doing any form of physical activity, our bodies tend to shut down quicker. However, with men, they've found that they are at a higher risk for heat stroke, which is life-threatening. Some of the risk factors that they have looked into and have found on some of this research is that it's based on body fat. And we know that women are typically have a higher body fat percentage when compared to men. So that's something to think about when you're outside and working out with a diverse group of people. So some conditions and diagnoses that we're going to go through with heat-related illnesses include dehydration, heat cramps, exhaustion, heat stroke, and then hyponatremia. It's important to know that at any point these can occur within yourself or an individual that's working outside, whether it's activity-based or they're actually working, so say at a construction site. So it doesn't have to go in any particular order. We're just going to go from the mildest form, which is dehydration, all the way to heat stroke and hyponatremia. Okay, so with dehydration, this is defined as the loss or removal of water from something. So in this situation, it would be the body. We have to be concerned about this because even if you're not being physically active outside and you're not consuming fluids daily, you can still experience dehydration symptoms. So these include dry mouth, excessive thirst, seeing spots kind of when you stand up or sit down to stand up, as well as general weakness, headache, dizziness, and then nausea and sometimes vomiting. One way to kind of test to see, or a few ways that you can see if you're dehydrated at any point, is when you're waking up in the morning, and typically people go to the bathroom, to kind of look at your urine color when it's in the toilet bowl. If it's a dark yellow or even brown, then you know that you need to start consuming fluids as soon as you get going. And that includes water and or a sports beverage. I wouldn't include caffeine or coffee into helping maintain your hydration because those are diuretics and expel water from your body. But if you are experiencing these symptoms with activity, you need to make sure you know what your limit is. So like I said, drinking fluids, including water, sports beverages. If it gets to the point where the spots or the excessive thirst are becoming too extreme, then you need to go to a cool area. The next one that I'm going to go over is heat cramps. Some of us may have experienced this either laying in bed after working outside all day or doing a high intensity activity. So basically like a calf cramp in the middle of the night. First thing that you want to do is stretch or pull your foot towards your shin. It can be very painful, no matter if you're sleeping or if you're in the middle of like a soccer game. But just because it happens in one part of the body, say like a calf or a hamstring, this can increase to potentially being the whole body, and that's concerning because the body is starting to overheat and the muscles aren't able to fire correctly with the activity that you're trying to do. Some management of it is continue to push fluids, sports beverage, water, and having somebody, ideally having someone help you stretch the affected area until the cramp releases. If you start experiencing whole body cramps or twitching, you need to call 911 because the stretching is not going to help it. Your body needs to be cooled. Okay, so the next one is going to be heat exhaustion. Now, heat exhaustion can range from the simple stages of dehydration, and they can go all the way to, which the next one would be, is heat stroke. So if you're experiencing this, it's the body's way of telling you that it's getting too hot. Some things to really note are if you're experiencing dizziness, decreased concentration or coordination, muscle cramps, abdominal cramps like stomach pain, and then excessive thirst. These symptoms can obviously occur too with just dehydration, but you really need to, if you're watching a soccer game and somebody goes down and they're unable to really run straight or they're starting to fall and stagger, they need to be removed from that activity because their body is telling them that it can't regulate itself like it's supposed to. If at any point somebody experiences these symptoms, again, if they're able to consume fluids, that's going to be the best way, or the more effective way is to really move them to an air-conditioned building or using cold towels. So dunking them in an ice cooler. It can be any kind of cloth because you're trying to dissipate the heat from the body. And if the body isn't able to sweat effectively to release the heat, the cold towels can kind of help that physically. But the next one that I'm gonna explain is you can quickly go from heat exhaustion to heat stroke. Okay, so heat stroke is defined as the condition marked by fever and often by unconsciousness. This is caused by a failure of the body's temperature regulating mechanism when exposed to excessively high temperatures. With this, like I said before, it is life-threatening, but it is 100% preventable. In the past 5 years, we've seen a lot of media coverage of athletes, specifically football players, some soccer players, dying of this, and it's because they weren't managed properly. And the only way to effectively treat somebody that's experiencing heat stroke is to put them in a cold tub of water. If you don't have access to a cold tub, then using a tarp, again, the cold towels, but really trying to externally cool the core temperature. So some symptoms of this are confusion in the beginning, disorientation, irritability, combativeness. And so what that looks like is as you're trying to either monitor somebody, watching them to see if they're going to get better after they're in shade, they kind of start pushing you away and they're not really answering your questions, but they're kind of conscious. But then if they become unconscious after being outside, then you need to know that that's what they're experiencing and their body needs to be cooled. If at any point somebody does need to be cooled, they need to go to the emergency room. They're gonna need IV fluids. They're gonna need full blood panel to check to make sure there hasn't been any organ damage. The first system that's typically will show signs of this is the kidneys. And one way for us to objectively diagnose if somebody has experienced heat stroke is based on rectal temperature. Now, not everybody has training with obtaining a rectal temp, but if the core temperature or any temperature is able to be obtained, then that's going to be better than nothing. However, it's important to know that just because you're cooling somebody, their body EMS is typically not going to transport them until their body temperature is below 102 degrees. And so that's something to keep in mind. But again, if anybody is really experiencing symptoms of heat stroke or even heat exhaustion, the time frame to know if it's become too late is anytime after 30 minutes. So if you're watching them for 30 minutes and they seem to be getting better, that's great. It's a good sign. But if they're not, if they're starting to crash or these symptoms become more present, then you need to call 911 and get them cooled as quickly as possible. The next one will be hyponatremia. And this is, basically called overhydration. So if someone is experiencing this, it's because they've consumed too much water and not enough of a carbohydrate solution. And the importance to note is that we think hydration and water is the only thing that our bodies need, but we also need minerals and we also need sugar. And that's where the carbohydrate solution, so like Gatorade, Powerade, Body Armor, even Pedialyte are good things to consume before, during, and after activity. But with specifically hyponatremia, there's a drop in sodium blood levels, and what can happen is someone will experience headaches, vomiting, confusion, irritability, dizziness, nausea, and muscle cramps. However, it's important to note that they will also have swelling of their feet and hands, and they have they're going to the bathroom a lot. So their kidneys are working overtime to flush out the fluids, but they're also taking out the salt and the potassium and other minerals and vitamins that they need. If they're able to consume any kind of beverage or food, then it needs to be a salty snack or a Pedialyte or Gatorade, whatever you have available. But again, if their symptoms don't improve within 30 minutes, they need to go to the emergency room as well because they'll need a saline drip to help treat this. So some predisposing factors, some of these we can manage on our own, but it's just important to note that if you're gonna be outside at any point, you should do this anyway. But some of them include inadequate sleep, poor diet, so that's not enough calorie fueling or just eating fast food consistently, deconditioning, not being acclimated, being recently sick. So if you've had the flu and you're finally fever-free, but you're taking Tylenol just as a preventative measure, just note that if you're outside, especially in Georgia weather, in the middle of the day, you could start experiencing heat-related symptoms much quicker than you would actually expect. Because the body is still having to recover even though you're not symptomatic from your previous illness. Another would be inappropriate work to rest ratio. So your training is too intense. It's okay to make sure that you're progressing back in, but also take into consideration the temperatures before you do that. And here in Atlanta, I typically work out in the mornings because there's less humidity. But as the day goes on, if I'm outside, then I know I need to come in just because it's getting so hot. And being in the South, humidity is the hardest thing to kind of work out in. Another one, to accurately check the temperature on if you have an Apple phone, they have a weather app, but they don't give what's called a wet bulb globe temperature reading. And that is the temperature, which will go into some charts that Georgia has for activity. But this temperature is the most accurate based on taking into the consideration of humidity, the wind chill, and the heat. So it could technically be, the thermometer could read over 100, but the wet bulb globe temp says it's like 88. So it's important to know that, but the ranges are much different based on those, the guidelines that we'll go through. And so things that we can control is obviously hydrating. No matter if you're inside all the time in an air-conditioned building, you should be trying to maintain a nutritious diet, well-balanced, as well as staying hydrated and not just drinking water. Focusing on a carbohydrate solution, drinking some juice, those things are going to be really important, as well as getting adequate sleep, which could be anywhere between 6 to 8 hours at night. So I've had two sport-specific guidelines. These are based on Georgia, and this one's for football specifically. So as you can see, the colors scale from green all the way to black, and they're based on those wet bulb globe temperatures that I explained earlier. But it explains basically when you need to limit the amount of practice time, which is the 87.1 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, as well as when you get into the red, you have to not practice with any kind of equipment. Another thing is during August and September, we have to make sure that we're not in the black. If we're in the black, there can't be any workouts outside because even with adequate water breaks, we can predispose our coaches, our athletes, really anybody to a heat-related illness. And that even includes just the general public. And it's not really all that of a good idea to be running in the middle of the day, so between 10 and 2, especially in the Southeast, because that's when the temperatures really just ramp up. And then I wanted to supply also the soccer regulations because they take into consideration just activity as a whole. So when it gets to the black, which is still that over 92 degrees based on the wet bulb globe temp, they say no activity outside, or you need to delay it until the temperatures reduce. Same thing with training outside when it's in the red, orange, yellow, and green. So a summary, basically dehydration, it affects our health and well-being as well as athletic performance. So it doesn't matter if you're a sedentary individual, whether you stay in the office all day and you just walk to your car to go home, it's still important to note that dehydration can happen at any given time. One little test that I wanted to note before is called the pinch test. And so all you have to do if you want to know, take your hand, squeeze the back of it, and if it stays, then you should know that you're dehydrated because the viscosity of the skin is almost too thin, and so it'll stay. I'm not too bad, but I can kind of still see a pinch when I do that. As well, also the heat-related illness symptoms that we went through, they can happen at any point, and it can be because of lifestyle habits, or it can become because of intense training in high heat. Also the 30-minute window for anybody that has experienced this, whether it's a child, an elderly individual, or even any a professional athlete, recreational athlete, anybody. If they don't improve after being removed from the activity or whatever workout they're doing, then they need to go to the emergency room because they're going to need further care. And that's it. I provided my email address, so if anybody has any questions or would like to know more information based on the wet bulb globe temp, yeah, that's it. And these are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. And a reminder that you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature at any point throughout this session, and we will answer and discuss those during the panel discussion. Our next speaker is Sarah Wolber. She will be presenting hydration before, during, and after exercise.
Hello, just give me one moment to pull up my slides. Okay, so thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with everyone today. My name is Sarah Wolber. I'm a registered and licensed dietitian. I currently work as a health educator in the Health 1-2-3 program at Emory University within the Center for the Study of Human Health. As a dietitian, I specialize in sports nutrition, so I really enjoy working with athletes and helping them achieve their goals. So I'm especially excited to talk with you all today about hydration, and more specifically the different types of hydration assessment, as well as hydration strategies for before, during, and after exercise. Okay, so right off the bat, I wanted to start off with this simple question: why do we hydrate? This may seem obvious to you, but the benefits and the underlying mechanisms may be farther reaching than you might presume. So first and foremost, it's not on this slide, but the main reason we hydrate is to maintain adequate blood volume, or in other words, fluid volume in our bodies. If we hydrate with a sports drink that has carbohydrate and sodium, then we can also maintain regular blood sugar levels and further support our ability to maintain adequate blood volume. So if we keep all of those mechanisms in check and in normal levels, we can then experience the benefits that you can see on this slide. So of course, as active women, we all hope to enhance our athletic performance, and that's something that adequate hydration can do. Adequate hydration can also lead to improved recovery, so that by the time we exercise again, we're in a better state. Adequate hydration can also maintain our mood, so we're in more positive spirits for a longer period of time while exercising. And finally, Holly talked about this a lot in her presentation, but adequate hydration can help reduce core body temperature, which is really important because when we move, our bodies generate heat. And because our bodies can only tolerate so much heat, we have to take certain measures in order to reduce that and keep it in normal levels. And one way to do that is through adequate hydration. Okay, so like I said, before I dive into the specific hydration strategies, I figured it was really important to start with identifying your actual hydration needs so we can figure out whether or not you're in a hydrated state or not. So there's a few different hydration strategies that are simple to use on your own, and that includes urine color, signs and symptoms, as well as body mass changes associated with sweat loss. So we'll dive into urine color first. So starting off with urine color, I know many of you have probably used this before in your own assessment of your hydration, but hopefully this will shed a little more light on it. But off to the left, you can see a spectrum of colors ranging from light yellow to dark yellow. In general, the lighter your urine basically means that you're in a more well-hydrated state. And it's lighter because there's more fluid diluting the solutes in your urine. When you get to the opposite end of the spectrum with the darker colors, it's darker because there's less fluid and you're less hydrated. Therefore, the minerals are in a higher concentration, so it's darker. Off to the right, you can see some reference ranges. So from 1 to 3, that essentially means you're in a state of euhydration or optimal hydration. It means you're meeting your hydration needs as they arise. 4 to 6 is when mild hypohydration comes into play, and this just means that there's not quite enough fluid being consumed to meet your needs. And so at this point, it's best to start consuming fluids to bump yourself back up to that upper range. And then finally, from 7 to 8, this is something that we really want to avoid. The more yellow, the dark yellow, brown urine you have generally means you're in a pretty hypohydrated state. At this point, you really need to start hydrating with water or preferably a sports beverage pretty soon to avoid any sort of negative consequences or have any unfortunate risks involved. So that's urine color. Moving into signs and symptoms, I feel that it's important to have a good grasp of how you're feeling during exercise in order to gauge your hydration status as well. So while problems can arise when you're not drinking enough, there can also be problems that arise when you're drinking too much, just like Holly explained in her presentation. So with hypohydration, again, this is when you're not consuming enough fluid to meet your needs. In this state, you can experience symptoms such as confusion, thirst, cramps, heat exhaustion, and the list goes on. So if you're exercising and you're experiencing these symptoms and you think, hey, maybe I haven't had enough to drink today, then it's possible that you're in a hypohydrated state and you need to start drinking fluids to get yourself back to a euhydrated state. If these symptoms are severe enough, then it's probably a good idea to receive medical attention at that point. So moving into hyperhydration, again, problems can arise when you're drinking too much for your body to handle, because this can lead to a condition known as hyponatremia. Or in other words, the sodium concentration in your blood is at an abnormally low level, and the severity of the symptoms can range from mild to life-threatening. So it's definitely something we don't want to ever happen. But as for some symptoms that might arise, this could include headache, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. So if you're exercising, you may be drinking more than you're used to, more than you need, and you start experiencing these symptoms, it's possible that you're in a hyperhydrated state. And what you should do then is, eat some salty snacks like crackers or sip on a sports beverage so that you can put your sodium back into a normal range. Again, if these symptoms are severe, then it's best to reach for immediate medical attention. Okay, so the final method for assessing your hydration status is identifying the changes in your body weight from pre to post exercise. So in order to do this, you need to weigh yourself immediately before exercise and immediately after, preferably nude, so that we can determine how much fluid has been lost while exercising via sweat. So, assuming you are beginning your exercise in a well-hydrated state, if by the time you finish exercising and you weigh less, then you can deduce that you're in a hypohydrated state because you have lost fluids that were not completely replaced. When your pre-exercise weight is the same as your post-exercise weight, this most likely means you're in a euhydrated state, and this is where you want to be because you met your hydration needs during the exercise. And then finally, hyperhydration, again, somewhere we don't want to be, is when pre-exercise weight is less than post-exercise weight. So in other words, you gained weight while exercising. And in general, this is caused by consuming fluids at a degree higher than your body needs. And the problem with this is that it can, again, lead to a risk of hyponatremia. So those are all the three hydration assessment techniques. Now we're going to use that information that we gathered by assessing our hydration to inform our hydration strategies before, during, and after exercise, as well as during the rest of the day. So starting with hydration before exercise, the first thing I want to emphasize here is that it's very, very important to start exercising in a well-hydrated state, because if you start exercising already hypohydrated or dehydrated, it's going to be even harder to be hydrated while exercising. The other point I want to emphasize here is that by no means should you wait until you feel thirsty in order to start hydrating, because at this point it means you're already dehydrated. So making sure you use those other fluid or hydration assessment techniques to make sure you are relying on more important indicators of hydration. So as for hydration before exercise strategies, studies show that about 2 to 4 hours prior to exercise, one should consume about 2 to 4 milliliters of fluid per pound of body weight. And this will help you achieve urine that's pale in color, so we can aim for that lemonade color. And then it also allows sufficient time to go to the bathroom prior to exercise or competition. So just for an example, we'll take a 150-pound individual and take that weight times 2 milliliters, which gives us 300 milliliters or 10 ounces that this person should drink about 2 to 4 hours prior to exercise. And mind you, that 10 ounces is on the lower range. So if we went up to the 4 milliliters, that would actually be about 20 ounces. So moving into hydration during exercise, the major goal of this component of your hydration plan is to prevent a hypohydration to where you've lost more than 2% of your body weight through fluids or through sweat. And the reason you don't want to exceed that is because studies show that any sweat loss beyond this generally means that athletic performance is going to be impaired. So we're going to aim from, we're going to be less than 2% fluid deficit. So as for your exact needs during exercise, it really depends on your exact sweat rate. We'll walk through this in the following slides on how to calculate that. But in general, most people's sweat rate ranges from about 0.3 to 2.4 liters per hour, or in other words, about 1 to 4 pounds per hour, which might be higher than you expect. You lose a lot of sweat pretty rapidly, and it really depends on your other factors like humidity and heat. When you're outside in Georgia, you might lose more sweat than if you're exercising in Georgia in the winter, for instance. So again, although your exact fluid needs will depend on various factors, in general, about 14 to 27 ounces per hour is usually adequate But again, determining your exact needs is going to be the safer bet. So if you sweat enough to be at risk of dehydration, it's best to aim to consume an equal amount of fluid every 10 to 20 minutes during exercise to meet your overall fluid needs. So instead of consuming large amounts once or twice per hour, it's better to consume it in smaller chunks every 10 to 20 minutes so that your body can utilize those nutrients or the water more effectively. Before I dive into the sweat rate calculation, I figured it's helpful to talk a little bit about what you want to reach for in terms of the beverages you consume during exercise. So that can be water or a sports beverage, but in general, when you're exercising for less than an hour, water is usually okay. You don't necessarily need to grab a sports beverage unless you know that you're a salty sweater or you perhaps started in when your blood sugar was too low. But generally studies show that consuming a sports beverage during exercise that lasts less than 1 hour doesn't normally enhance athletic performance. So when it comes to exercise that lasts longer than an hour, this is when you want to reach for about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And this is to, one, help you keep your blood sugar in normal limits, because at this point, you may have burned through your carbohydrate stores, and we don't want our body to dip into other energy reserves, such as our muscle. When you exercise for longer than 2.5 hours, then you can bump up your carbohydrate intake even more to about 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And when you're looking for a sports beverage, there are so many out there, it can become very overwhelming trying to find the one that suits you the best or that has the optimal formulation. So in general, research shows that sports drinks that have about 6 to 8 grams of carbohydrate per 100 milliliters or 3 ounces are your best bet, because they can help increase the speed of gastric emptying and energy utilization. These sports beverages should also have about 100 to 200 milligrams of sodium per cup or 8 ounces, because when you sweat, we lose sodium, and sodium is really important for fluid balance in your body. Then the last point here is, when you are reaching for a sports beverage, try to look for those that have a mixture of carbohydrate sources, such as glucose plus sucrose or dextrose plus fructose. And this is because studies have suggested that a mixture can actually enhance your energy utilization from these carbohydrates. Okay, so now we're going to get into the sweat rate calculation for hydration during exercise. And again, we're going to calculate your sweat rate because that determines your fluid needs. So this is a 3-step calculation. It's pretty simple. Number 1, the first step is calculating your fluid deficit. So this is pre-exercise weight minus post-exercise weight. The second step is total sweat loss. So that would be fluid deficit, which we just calculated in step 1. You add that to the volume of fluid that you may or may not have consumed while exercising. And the final step is calculating your sweat rate, which is your total sweat loss over the duration of the exercise. I know that was a lot of information without a lot of context, so I'm going to walk you through a brief example of how this might be applied. So here's a case study. Shannon is a competitive runner. During practices, she often feels fatigued, and her urine is on the darker side after practice. On a good day, she'll drink about 10 ounces of fluid over a 2-hour-long workout. So the question is, what are Shannon's hydration needs during exercise? So in the orange box at the top, you can see her pre-exercise weight and her post-exercise weight, and the reference is that the 1 pound is the equivalent of 16 ounces. So subtracting her post-exercise weight from her pre-exercise weight gives us a fluid deficit of about 3 pounds or 48 ounces. And then using that to calculate total sweat loss, we add fluid deficit of 48 ounces plus 10 ounces of fluid that she consumed, and that gives us about 58 ounces of total sweat loss. And then finally, the last step is to calculate her sweat rate, which is her total sweat loss divided by the duration of the activity, which was 2 hours. And that gives us 29 ounces of sweat loss or fluid loss per hour. So if Shannon loses about 30 ounces of sweat per hour, she should therefore consume about 30 ounces of fluid per hour to meet those demands, but ideally split them into smaller chunks every 10 to 20 minutes or so. So last but not least, this is another very important component of the hydration plan, and this is hydration after exercise. So the major goal of this part is to help replace the body weight or the fluid that was lost during exercise with fluid. And then the rate at which you replace this fluid depends on your next exercise session. So if you're exercising twice in a day, you want to return to that original body weight prior to your next exercise. But in general, the faster you replace your fluids within reason is going to benefit you in terms of recovery. Studies show that drinking about 25 to 50% more than the final fluid loss ensures effective rehydration and accounts for additional sweat and urine losses. Because even though you stopped exercising, a lot of times you're probably still sweating and you might want to go to the bathroom. So it accounts for the additional fluid loss. And then finally, in terms of recovery and hydration after exercise, it's helpful to consume sodium either in salty foods or sports beverages after exercise, because this again helps maintain an adequate fluid balance inside the body. So that was a lot of information, but here are some take-home points just so you can walk away knowing some of the major points of this presentation. First of which is monitor your hydration status so that you know when you're in a well-hydrated state and when you're not in a hydrated state. Never wait until you're thirsty to hydrate, because again, by the time you're thirsty, this often means you're already dehydrated. Always start exercising in a well-hydrated state. If you start dehydrated, odds are you're probably not going to be exercises in a hydrated state, even if you try to with lots of fluids. Aim to match sweat loss with fluid intake during exercise. And finally, rehydrate after exercise until normal body weight has been restored. That is all I have, and these are my references. Thank you so much for having me. Please go ahead and submit any questions if you have any. I'm happy to answer them at the end of the session.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Jennifer London. She'll be speaking on COVID updates in the high school setting.
All right. All right, hang on, let me hit share here. All righty, thank you, Emily. I'm Jennifer. I am one of the athletic trainers at Emory Sports Medicine, and I work with Dr. Courtney Gleason in the office. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and how that's affecting high school sports. Obviously, this is very evolving kind of day by day, and there's a lot of research needed. So I'm just going to kind of touch on some things and leave you with some questions that coaches, parents, and athletes should be asking their school or their school district or their organization which they participate in. All right, we're going to go over a little bit of how it's affecting high school athletes, the classifications that sports have been placed into here recently, an update for Georgia, as well as some of the neighboring states, how this has affected pre-participation physicals, how we phased return to play after the quarantine, and then kind of some action plans and some policies. But we're going to start with what is COVID-19. So hopefully everybody has heard of COVID-19 at this point. It's a contagious respiratory illness that's caused by a new strand of the coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2. It is very similar to the RNA that was present with the first SARS strand, which is why they labeled it a newer strand of that. Symptoms appear 2 to 14 days after exposure to the virus and include fever or chills. For this particular virus, it's considered a fever over 100.4. And then new or worsened cough, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, fatigue, muscle or body aches,
sore throat, congestion, new loss of taste or smell, headaches, nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. The nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea are very important as that's what seems to be most present in the adolescent population. Recently, the state of Georgia has reported a little over 16,000 positive cases in children under the age of 17. And then older adults or individuals with underlying medical conditions such as heart or lung disease or diabetes seem to be at higher risk of developing more serious complications. This can infect anybody at any age, but the underlying medical conditions seem to make it a little bit more serious. So how is this kind of bothering high school sports? So as far as a high school sport is concerned, the more people a child or an athlete interacts with, the closer that physical interaction, the more sharing of equipment, and the longer that interaction, the higher the risk of exposure or spread. So if we take a 2-hour volleyball practice with a team bag of volleyballs, that's going to be a higher risk environment than a 2-hour tennis practice where the kids all use their own tennis balls and rackets and no one is sharing equipment. So they may still be playing tennis with each other, but they're not touching each other's tennis balls, they're not sharing tennis rackets, nothing like that. So what is being researched right now? Right now we're trying to figure out how long is an asymptomatic individual, so someone who is COVID-19 positive but has absolutely no symptoms. How long are they contagious, and is there a way to tell when that period passes, or do we just have to wait until there's a negative test? How likely is an adolescent or a minor to pass COVID-19 to an adult or to a younger child? And how effective is disinfecting a porous surface? So we know we can wipe down, Clorox wipe or bleach wipe hard surfaces, but when it comes to tennis balls or volleyballs, basketballs, the softball gloves, what can we use to clean those surfaces that A, isn't going to break that surface down quickly because those things are expensive, and B, how's it going to be effective? How long is it going to take to kill the virus or to kill anything on that surface, and how effective are those products? So the National Federation of High Schools, they have a sports medicine committee, and they released a statement in May that outlined a return to sports, and they listed the sports in classifications. The Georgia High School Association also endorses flag football, bass fishing, esports, literary, and riflery. Those were not included in this list. But low-risk sports, participation allows for social distancing. There's no sharing of equipment, or that equipment can be completely cleaned in between use of competitors. So your individual track and field events, your individual swimming events, golf, diving, weightlifting, simply because the weight bars and the weights can be completely cleaned in between competitors. Sideline cheer and dance, because there's no stunting involved. Skiing, single rowing, cross country, fencing, and bowling. And then this is where your bass fishing, providing that there's enough space on the boat to social distance. Esports, literary, and riflery would come into play. For moderate risk sports, there's close sustained contact, but they can use protective equipment, or there's intermittent close contact, or the equipment cannot be completely cleaned in between use of competitors. So your basketball, although some would argue that this should fall into the high risk category, volleyball, baseball, softball, soccer, simply because it's intermittent close contact. Water polo, gymnastics, ice hockey, volleyball, tennis, relay swimming, girls lacrosse, crew 7-on-7, and relay track and field events. This would also include your competitive dance and your flag football. And then for high risk sports, there's close sustained contact between competitors with pretty much no protective barriers, or there's not the ability to use a protective barrier effectively. So your football, your wrestling, your boys lacrosse, and your competitive cheerleading. Some would also put basketball back up here into this category as well. All right, so what is the GHSA doing about it right now? So GHSA governs most high school sports in the state of Georgia. There are other organizations within the state of Georgia, and some schools simply choose not to be part of the GHSA. But on July 22nd, they decided to alter the seasons of regular football, which is 11-man football, and girls flag football. So they pushed football season back for 2 weeks, but practices could start as planned. This made the first football game start September the 4th, and it pushes state championships back to almost New Year's Day. And then all the other fall sports could start as scheduled. They also expect that any and all positive cases be reported to them. And if an individual, a coach, or an athlete is screened out of a practice, so they have symptoms or they have a fever, they expected that to be reported to them as well. And then as of Thursday, they moved competitive cheerleading to be a winter sport. They moved literary to the spring for concerns of projecting particles into the air in an enclosed environment. And they canceled all spring or football scrimmage games. As of yesterday, Rockdale County also decided that they are not going to participate in sports for the first semester. So they didn't technically cancel their sports, but they pushed their sports to the spring semester, which will work if any other county does. Otherwise, they will be playing, the 3 schools will simply be playing each other for a season that doesn't count for anything. So what are some neighboring states doing during all of this? Tennessee added sports to their state of emergency so that they were allowed to participate as of the end of July. Nashville Metro, which also includes Davidson County, has said they are not going to allow any games or competitions until at least the beginning of September. South Carolina altered pretty much all this fall sports seasons. The football is going to have an altered season, so they're only going to play 7 regular season games, which for most schools will be region games, and they're not going to start until September. Competitive cheer is going to align with the football season, and then everything else is going to start at the end of August. And then Alabama is playing everything as scheduled, except each and every fall sport has their own set of rule modifications. So football has longer timeouts, volleyball is not going to switch sides of the bench in between games, things like that. But every sport has their own set of rule modifications in Alabama. All right, so how does this affect pre-participation physicals? So Georgia initially gave everybody a bye, so everybody got a 2-month bye if your physical was good through the end of the school year. As of July 28th, every athlete participating needed a valid physical. But if the past medical history should now include a question about, have you been diagnosed with COVID-19? Because on a daily basis, those athletes are going to need to be screened for things like ongoing chest pain or pressure with exercise, difficulty breathing and dizziness with exercise. So this is going to be different than your kids with known asthma. These are kids that maybe didn't have asthma to begin with, but are having difficulty breathing or complaining of dizziness during exercise, or they're having a decrease in exercise tolerance. So we all know everybody had this big long break where these teenagers sat around and, let's be honest, did not do what they were supposed to be doing as far as home workouts or going for a jog or anything like that. But if there's one kid who maybe was diagnosed with COVID-19 previously, who thinks that they're fine, they feel fine, but they're not tolerating the heat or the return to exercise like their friends are, that would be something to watch for. In addition, these athletes may need further testing, so pulmonary testing, heart testing, or kidney function testing may be necessary just to make sure that the difficulty breathing or the decreased exercise tolerance is simply going to take them a little bit longer and that it's not an actual issue with the heart or the lungs. All right, so when we started to come back to sports, we did do a phased return to sport. Initially, it was to limit any contact with the asymptomatically positive athletes or coaches. So these kids or coaches that feel completely fine, have no idea that they have COVID-19. We're trying not to spread it all throughout the community because at the end of the day, these are kids. They go home to whatever home life that they have. We don't want to spread that around. And then smaller groups and phased returns makes an easier contact tracing if it's necessary. It also allowed all these teenagers that have been sitting at home, not doing anything like they would normally be doing. It gave them a gradual return to sport conditioning and to get back out in the heat and participate. In my opinion, that's the biggest part of this, as these kids had probably never had a couple of months where they didn't do anything. And now all of a sudden, we're just going to throw them back out into the Georgia heat. And like Holly talked about earlier, there's some considerations needed with that. So with phase 1, we took very, very small groups. We screened them prior to every practice. That included a temperature check. It also includes all the staff or the coaches that were present for that day. There's absolutely no changing of groups. That way, if a contact trace needs to be done, you know exactly who was there, you know where they go home to, you can trace that. No locker room use. Any shared equipment like weights need to be cleaned in between uses, not after the group, but in between each and individual use. And then athletes come dressed and ready to work out. They have their own water, and then they leave when they're done. Everything gets disinfected, and there are no visitors, no guest speakers, no dads popping their head in to make sure everything is okay, none of that. With the phase 2, they took either 2 of the smaller groups and combined them into 1, or maybe kids that weren't participating in the smaller groups, they can add them in 2 groups to make those groups larger. Again, those groups remain the same. Everybody gets screened prior to practices or workouts. If the locker rooms are used, they do every 2 lockers or whatever makes 6 feet in between each individual. Nothing gets shared, and everything gets cleaned in between uses, but this is when you can start putting in some sport-specific equipment. So we just need to make sure we're wiping everything down at the end. But we can start in with some drills, some individual drills, things like that. With phase 3, it was a lot larger groups. If they're standing on the sideline, then there's some distance between them. There's still no sharing of water bottles. There's still no sharing of clothing or towels, but we do put some contact back in. So your basketball drills can start back up again. Your football drills can run routes, things of that nature. So there's a little bit of contact in between groups. There should have been some heat acclimation at this point, and then we're still cleaning everything in between groups and in between uses. All right, so why do we do all this? What do we need to worry about with COVID-19? This is going to be where all of the questions and concerns come into play. So every school or school district or youth sport organization should have an action plan and a policy in place for this, just like we would for concussions or for anything else that happens in sports. COVID-19 also needs an action plan and a policy. So why do we need that? Well, what happens to this team or this group when an athlete or a coach tests positive for COVID-19? What is expected? Is the whole sport just going to shut it down for 2 weeks? How do we know that nobody else is going to test positive? All of that should be in this action plan. And then what is expected of the athletes or coaches at practices and games? Are they expected to just put their equipment, wherever is safe, or is there certain places to put their equipment? Are they expected to stretch in a certain area and then move on? They should know what is expected of them at practices and games. It shouldn't be made up as they go. What if a family member tests positive for COVID-19, but the athlete is not showing any symptoms? That should be part of this action plan. What happens if an opposing team has an athlete that tests positive 2 days after we played them? And what is expected of spectators at games? Are we going to have a concession stand? Are they expected to socially distant? Do they need to wear masks? All of this should be written down. And then every coach, athlete, and parent should know who has access to these plans and who is expected to update these plans and policies. So for a policy, it's going to be a little bit different than your action plan. A policy is something that should be put in place and considered every single day. So there should be some return to activity guidelines, a cleaning policy, who is expected to clean and what and when. Hydration, if an athlete drinks all of their water during practice because we expected them to bring their water, then how are we going to refill that water? It's Georgia, it's hot outside, it's muggy outside, they need access to some sort of hydration, but we totally understand that 15 teenage girls who have had their hands in and out of their batting gloves should not be messing around with the same water cooler. And then equipment considerations, who's expected to clean the equipment? What are we going to use to clean the equipment? If the kids are supposed to clean their own equipment, who's going to provide that for them? And then screening and testing expectations. So if we're going to screen the athletes every day, if they're going to school and they're screened when they come in, is that sufficient enough? Or who is supposed to screen them? If they test positive, who is supposed to test them? Things of that nature. Coaches should have access to this policy. Coaches should be allowed to share this policy with parents and athletes. This policy should not be something that's kept in a folder in the back of the school board office, and coaches should always know when a change is made. And then everybody involved should always know what is expected of them at all times. This should be something that's written down and can be shared at all times. So if there's a coaches meeting, if there's a parents meeting, if coaches sit down with their players, they should be able to read through this and kind of go through what is expected of each party. For the action plan, we need to include the screening procedure. So what are we going to do for games and practices? There should also be a plan in place for what happens if an athlete tests positive, what happens if a coach tests positive, what happens if an opposing team member tests positive, and what happens if a parent or somebody that these athletes live with tests positive. So all of these things need to be considered. When and how are we going to test these kids? So if somebody tests positive, are we going to require them to test negative prior to returning? We're going to test everybody prior to returning. If we're making testing mandatory, who's going to pay for that? If it's a public school setting and we're making testing mandatory, who is going to pay for that? We can't just expect that to fall back on to parents that may or may not have a job currently. And then there should be some sort of return to participation guidelines. So just like we expect a kid with a concussion to return to play gradually, the same thing should be happening for somebody that tested positive for COVID-19. So the body just fought a pretty nasty virus. We need some sort of steps of return in between fighting that virus and returning to play at a high level of sport. Again, every coach should have access to this action plan and they should understand their role. A coach should have a very specific role in this. They are not expected to carry out the entire action plan. There should be their role in it, the principal's role, the athletic director's role, the school board's role. Everybody should have a role in this action plan. And then parents and athletes should be aware that this plan exists and that we're going to follow it.
2 minutes.
Okay. So there should be open and honest conversations about the policies and plans between the coaches, the parents, and the athletes. There should be absolutely no favoritism. No, yeah, but she's our starting pitcher. No, yeah, but he just has allergies. There shouldn't be any of that. It's a policy that's in place. We're going to stick with it. Parents and athletes should be having their own open discussions about their concerns and the familial risk. So if a parent feels like it's safe for their kid to participate, that kid should know why. If they feel like it's not safe to participate because of something else that's going on in the household, then they should know why. These kids are old enough to know why they should and should not participate. And then what is expected of spectators for games and concession stands. And again, with the cleaning, who is going to clean that? And if an athlete is expected to clean it, who is going to supply that? There's just some resources, and then there's also going to be a 3-part youth sports and COVID-19. It's going to start August the 11th. It's completely free. It is geared towards coaches and parents and understanding how this affects your team and your athletes. It's 1 hour on each of the 11th, 12th, and 13th, and the NATA is putting that on, and I'm happy to provide that link for anybody who would like it. And that's it.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And our last speaker of the day will be Samantha Powell. She'll be presenting on a COVID update in the collegiate setting.
Hello, everyone. Let's get this shared screen. Okay. All right. There we go. Hi, I'm Sam. I am going to be doing your COVID update for the collegiate setting. It is very much similar to the high school setting. And I am the head athletic trainer at Agnes Scott College down here in Decatur, Georgia. So first I have my disclaimer. I don't have any financial associations with anyone that is mentioned, any of the screening tools or any of the EMR software. This presentation is, based on facts pulled from the NCAA and the FDA and the CDC, but best practices are definitely my opinion. And I ask participants to use their discretion when using the information contained in this presentation. So our objectives are kind of going over the general direction for athletics during this 2021 school year. We're going to go over return to campus considerations. We're going to go over resocialization, screening and testing options, best practices in athletic training facilities and on the field. We're going to go over return to play protocols for positive tested athletes and some other considerations that we might want to think about moving forward. So the direction for athletics for 2021, the NCAA fall championships have been reviewed and revised, and as of right now, the governing boards have decided for Division II, the NCAA championships will be canceled for the 2021 year, and that was released August 5th, so not too long ago. Same with Division III, the NCAA fall championships are canceled for this school year as well as of August 5th. There's been no formal decision made yet from Division I, but there is a deadline for August 21st to make that decision. Just like information with the CDC and the FDA, the NCAA is releasing and revising guidelines on a weekly basis. Athletes can still train, and that is determined by the institution. Some schools have decided to go a reduced density option, so even if the school may be considering remote learning this semester, the athletes might be able to be brought back to campus anyway, so they could still do some type of formal training with their teams. In other cases, that is not an option, and everyone would be remote, and then the athletes are training at home on their own. With all of these changes with the NCAA, it is up to the school to create accommodations for both eligibility and scholarships at the Division II, Division I level. If an athlete chooses not to play because of weariness of contracting COVID, it should not be held against them. So that's something that schools have to determine when making decisions for this season. Obviously, the school must adhere to federal, state, and local guidelines related to COVID-19. So it comes down to the state first before a school can make decisions on how athletics will be played out. So return to campus considerations. We want to encourage our athletes to test prior to coming to campus. And then on top of that, having them take that 14-day quarantine prior to move-in. Best practice is also to have some type of modified quarantine once they get to campus. In a lot of cases, athletes are coming in before the general population of the school. So having them have these quarantines prior to coming and a modified quarantine when they get to campus allows for more accurate testing and screening. Just like in the high school setting, you want to phase groups onto campus. So you want to phase by team, and you want to phase as you participate in activity. So you want to make sure that the groups start off, strength and conditioning, individual training, and then work their way to eventually practicing as a full team. As an institution and athletics department, you want to have a testing strategy for athletic activities, including preseason and postseason, not just the regular season. And you want to identify your high-risk population. So that is going to be your contact sports. For me personally, I was taking into consideration the living arrangements for the athletes. Not all athletes live on campus. Who are they living with? Are they living with another athlete, an athlete from their team or from a different team? Are they working? What is their day-to-day looking like? Because someone who doesn't necessarily live on campus in our bubble, and you'll hear me say bubble more than once in this presentation, an athlete that lives off campus or works off campus is going to be a part of that high risk group. Obviously, we want to do some type of daily screening or self-check. And then, in between practices, we want to really hone in on social distancing and using face coverings. So we want to make sure that we are doing things on the computer if we don't have to be in a room together. So if we're doing, scout and team meetings, those can be done virtually instead of meeting, and as well as scheduling with staff as needed. You also want to take into consideration the resocialization, so we'll get into the different phases, as well as acclimatization. So not only are we doing something that we would normally do with, like our football teams and taking those phases with adding equipment in the heat, you have to also consider that many of these athletes have not participated in any type of sporting activity in months. So they are not going to be trained the way that we expect them to come in trained. So we really have to make sure that they are getting acclimated to being out in the heat, training again, doing dynamic activities, as well as staying hydrated. I mean, a lot of us have kind of been inside on the computer, so how well do they take care of their bodies while they were at home in quarantine? And lastly, we want to try to train outdoors. If we want to be able to space out, take in fresh air. If that's not an option for some of our indoor sports, we want to be in well-ventilated areas. So if your institution doesn't have the best ventilation, we need to open up some doors. So resocialization. So we want to bring the athletes back to campus in phases. So we'll start with, we'll bring in the soccer team and kind of get them sort of acclimated. Then we'll bring in volleyball, or if you have a football team, you bring in football first. And we want to start off with individual training. Like if you're working with a soccer team, you do just your goalkeepers. Like you have like 3 or 4 of them, very small group. If you want to, work with midfielders, just that small group. So you want to do stuff in small groups, and then over time broaden until you get to the full team atmosphere. Like I said in the previous slide, you want to get these athletes acclimated to the heat, to the training. They have not been doing what they're used to doing over the summer. So we really want to make sure that they're taking that in consideration. A lot of these fall athletes lost their spring training opportunities with their coaches because their school year was cut a little bit short. So we want to make sure that we are giving them all of these opportunities to build themselves back up, to get stronger and recreate or reestablish their healthy habits. Like I said, we want to determine those high risk groups. So I was doing a red, yellow, green situation. So if someone was living off campus, working off campus, living with a high risk roommate or relative, that is someone that we want to test probably more frequently than a cross-country runner who lives alone that doesn't have a work-study job. It's just the difference in the exposure that they're going to get. Scout and team meetings, they should be virtual, so that we're not meeting in the gym, or we're not meeting in a small classroom in front of a television. X's and O's can be done on a computer, so we can make sure that we're not meeting unnecessarily. And then any type of one-on-one with a coach, if it needs to be in person, it's by appointment. We cannot allow these athletes to just come in and out of the building as needed. They're so used to being able to stop in after class, in between classes on their lunch, to come talk, and we really have to push appointment making and doing stuff online. So for screening, we want to have some type of daily screening tool. A lot of the electronic medical record software has developed different modules that allow you to do COVID-19 screening. If you don't have something like that in the EMR software that you have, there's questionnaire applications. Apple has one with the CDC that's online. There's apps specific to just COVID testing. And then if you want to do old school paper style or Survey Monkey, those are great too, as long as you have someone that's willing to collect and store that data. And these types of screenings should be done daily. I request that they are done 90 minutes before practice, so I know before you even show up that you don't have any type of positive test on paper. Daily temperature checks are important, you know, and something that you want to track. A lot of businesses are tracking temperatures just as you walk in the building. And a lot of people are doing O2 measurements too. So pulse ox, just kind of making sure that everyone is as well as they think they are coming in to our building. So with the screening tools, obviously we're going to ask questions, shortness of breath, headache, chills. You want to ask cardiovascular questions. Most of the EMR softwares that have the module for COVID testing, it's preloaded, but you can always create your own for yourself. For our athletes, we have to make sure that we're honing in on like swelling of the hands and feet and redness. There's been symptoms that have been showing up differently in the active population and the younger population. So we want to make sure we're covering all of our bases. And within that screening tool, like in the previous presentation, you want to ask questions about exposure. Do you know someone that has been exposed? Have you been near them? Do you live with someone who has been exposed or who hasn't? Other opportunities for us to kind of get a better idea of how the athletes are living outside of coming to practice. So for testing, we want to test our student athletes and staff within the first week of arrival. We hope that they were tested before they left. We hope that they self-quarantined for 14 days before leaving and coming to campus, but just to cover all of our bases, in a perfect world, we want to test these student athletes and staff when they get to campus. Once we have figured out who our higher risk group is, we want to determine the frequency of that, of that test. So your high risk groups, you probably want to test every 2 weeks. Your lower risk groups or the general population of your staff and athletes, you might want to do every 3 weeks or once a month. If your team is traveling, you should test after travel so that you can make sure that nothing was contracted in the interim. You know, if you're going on a long distance trip, you know, the stops are going to be made. Obviously, you're in contact with another team, not at home. So you want to make sure that you're covering all your bases. And then some of our testing options in your city could be your Board of Health, the local urgent care, select pharmacies, and Drug-Free Sport is offering testing options as well. The biggest thing with these options is cost, obviously, and then how available is it? So there are many places that are willing to come to your campus as long as you have the right number of people. If you have a large population to test, they will come out and test you. If you're doing smaller groups, you can possibly send them off campus. Maybe your campus wellness center has the opportunity to test if they have the equipment to do so. Drug-free sport, just like we would for drug testing, they collect specimen and then they take it and send it off to the lab. They will do the same thing with COVID testing. And on the flip side, if you're choosing not to use a drug-free sport clinician, your athletic trainer can collect specimen and then overnight it, and then you'll have results within a couple days as well. So protect the bubble. I have been telling people over and over, like, think of the bubble. So your bubble is your athletes, your coaches, your athletic staff. But you also want to think about like your team managers, people that work in the buildings where the gym is, or if you have people that work in the clubhouse on the soccer field. Anyone that's coming in and out of your facilities as a worker, you want to test them too. So if you're in a situation where you want to test on your campus or at your facility, but you need to make the numbers, those are the extra people that should be coming in and getting tested. People don't think about the team managers, but they're around the team just as much as the coaches, even though they're not necessarily playing or participating in any type of athletic activity. We want to make sure that we're testing everyone and protecting our bubble as best as possible. Anything from outside of the bubble coming in is going to be inevitable, but we want to make sure that we're protecting those inside the bubble to the best of our abilities. So we're going to go over some best practices in the athletic training room and in our athletic facilities. So we want to make sure we have limited numbers of people in the athletic training room and the weight room. So again, like I was saying before, we want to tell the athletes that they have to schedule appointments. So they're not going to get the hour or 90 minutes before practice to just come down and do whatever they need. A lot of times, those are the athletes that are kind of hanging out and don't really need anything. So we want to make sure that those that need treatment are coming in to get it, and it's scheduled, and we're not taking up that time with kids just kind of hanging out on tables. We want to make sure that there's cleaning in between uses of the tables, and we want to make sure there's cleaning in between uses of the weight room. Weight room's another place that if there's no type of weight room monitor, then we really need to make sure that the athletes know to be in there in small increments based on the size of the weight room. So my weight room can house 10 safely, but we're going to shave that down to 6 plus a coach, just to make sure that there is no type of overlap. In regards to the whirlpool, you want to do 1 at a time. I know there's been those days when you're piling in 2 or 3 at a time, sometimes 4 if everyone's standing, and we're really going to have to draw that back. That's going to extend some of our time after practice, but that's the best practice, is to only have 1 person in the whirlpool at a time. We're going to discourage our athletes from showering in the locker rooms. We want them to shower at home or in a dorm. There's going to be cases where you have commuters who don't necessarily have that option. Definitely need to look into what your school offers for commuters, or if there's a way to designate a visitor's locker room or something for your commuters. That is fine as well, as long as that room is on the cleaning schedule with your cleaning staff. Like I was saying before, no hanging out in the locker room or in the training room. For these college athletes, that is something that they enjoy doing. Just like they would come talk to their coach in between class or at lunch, some of our athletes are coming down, hanging out in the locker room, or studying in the locker room, or just hanging out in the training room because no one's doing rehab. We'll really have to discourage that and make sure that they're not just hanging out. We want spacing on our benches. So if an athlete is not necessarily on the field, we want them on the bench with face coverings. We want hand cleansing stations in our facilities, inside and out. No shared water bottles on the team, just like high school. If they're bringing their own water bottle, they're the ones that have to fill it. And if they don't have one, they have to use cups, and cups are 1 use. So not the best practice when it comes to recycling and saving Mother Earth, but we're going to have to get rid of cups after 1 use. We also want to make sure there's no spectators at events for now, and we want to screen our officials and workers at our events to make sure that no one from outside the bubble is coming in and can possibly be infecting other people. Then we want to educate. We want the athletes to be aware of the protocols of the institution of our school and of athletics, so that if something comes up, they know what the next step is. We also want them to be mindful of if someone on their team or someone they know contracts COVID-19, that they are not going and pointing fingers, as in, you should have ... We just want to be mindful that the inevitable might happen, even if you take all the precautions. And we want to make sure that we are supporting our athletes in the event that someone tests positive.
2 minutes.
Okay. So if someone does test positive, we want to make sure that they are referred through the institution's COVID-19 protocol. If they are an asymptomatic positive test, they want to isolate for 10 days. And if they are symptomatic, we want to have a minimum of 10-day isolation after the resolution of their fever or their symptoms have gone away. In that time, we want to make sure that there is a cardiac consultation or some type of electrocardiogram, so that athletes we're not missing anything with these athletes, because there are cardiac considerations with COVID-19. Any type of asymptomatic or symptomatic positive tests needs to have little to no exercise for at least 10 days, and we have to retest. I cannot stress that enough. Even if you go through and you're asymptomatic, it's in your best interest to retest anyway. Some institutions recommend 2 negative tests before returning to activities or work. Last, I just want to go over some other considerations. Obviously, if an athlete tested positive and has a negative test later, we probably need to go through some phasing and acclimatization for them as well. You need to know your institution's ability to accommodate isolation. So if you're at a school that doesn't have the ability to have single rooms or a place to put positive tested people, then it might not be in the best interest to bring athletics back if you can't accommodate the isolation. What is the contact tracing availability at that school? Do you have people in place to kind of help with tracing the virus? And then does your institution have an emergency action plan for staff? You know, we think about the athletes, and what if the athletic trainer gets it? What if a coach gets it? We have to have plans in place for that. And understanding the insurance. So if an athlete has insurance through the school, will that school insurance cover them if they test positive? Does your accident insurance cover COVID? That for that secondary policy. And then if you have facilities that are used by the public, what protocols are you taking to cover them, to protect them, and to protect the athletes from the public coming in and out? Again, we want sanitation stations everywhere by your ice machines, right inside the doors, inside of offices, going in and out of the gym. And then you have to also consider team travel. If you can swing it, try not to travel overnight. You know, can you go up and back in a day, or do you have to meet somewhere in the middle? A lot of things go into a game or a competition, but you want to make sure it's the best interest of both teams and for all of the athletes. And here are my references, and I look forward to questions afterwards.
All right. Thank you very much, Samantha. I now invite all of our speakers to go ahead and turn on their cameras for a few questions that we've received. And audience members, any continued questions, feel free to send them in through the Q&A. So our first question is, for teams that do not have an athletic trainer, what should coaches and parents have accessible to prevent or mitigate heat-related injuries or emergencies as they occur?
So the best thing to have is to make sure that there's cold water available. That is making sure that there's the gallon jugs that you can buy from Home Depot or Walmart. Another thing is just to have kind of the first aid ice packs. Having a bunch of those, because if you really need to cool somebody quickly, you can break them and it'll help instead of having ice available. But if you want to be super prepared, having a tarp and always having like one of those 10-gallon jugs filled with ice water, because then you're going to literally put them in the bag. Their head doesn't need to be underneath it. Now that's for emergencies, but with COVID, it's kind of difficult. But if you think somebody is really having a heat-related illness and they're not getting better and you need to cool them, ice packs around the neck, the armpits, the groin, cold towels wiping off the sweat as it comes so it can evaporate. But if you are able to put them in a bucket of ice cold water, then that'll be the most sufficient and quickest way to do it. But you use what you have.
Great, thank you. And our next question, for those who work with middle school and high school athletes, what is the most efficacious way to educate about hydration? And as many may not have access to dietitians, who is the best to provide this education?
That's a really good question. I would say that in general, what high school and adolescents should know is to adequately hydrate during the day, all day long, every day, because again, if you start exercising already in a dehydrated state, that can put you at risk for one, a heat-related illness or just dehydration. So making sure that they look at their urine color when they go to the bathroom, that can certainly be a good indicator if they're drinking enough. But as for certain resources, I think the, let's see, like most schools will have like maybe like a trainer accessible, or online there's the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. They have lots of great resources, or eatright.org. That's a website run by registered dietitians. But as for a human resource where dietitians are not available, I think a trainer would probably be your next best bet.
Great. And for school districts in areas who have delayed their academic starts or beginning virtually, especially in the metro Atlanta area, are teens still allowed to begin in-person practice?
Yes. So if they're virtual learners, there are start dates for practices in sports, at least at the high school level, in the state of Georgia and all the neighboring states too. They've said that it doesn't matter if they're going to start virtually, that unless a school district decides virtual learning means nobody on campus, that a virtual learner can still participate in after school activities and clubs as long as they're allowed on campus.
Great. And is measuring pulse oximetry an NCAA recommendation, or is that something Agnes Scott has specifically chosen to implement?
It has been a recommendation, but it's not a requirement. The biggest thing is the regular screening questionnaire and temperature. I've been doing pulse ox for those that might have a little bit more of a high risk or a compromised immune system, like with our diabetics, Crohn's disease, liver and kidney patients, but it is just a recommendation, is not a requirement. Temperature is first and foremost the best way to determine if someone is ill, if they might necessarily not have any other symptoms.
And what are you using as a cutoff for a concerning pulse oximetry?
So what I've been seeing across the board with the urgent cares is under 90. So you also have to take into consideration people with asthma and maybe other respiratory issues. It's obviously a case-by-case basis, but under 90 is questionable. So you just want to make sure that you want to follow up with their doctor.
Great. And specifically amongst our high school and collegiate athletes, we've heard testing a lot in the media. Is it recommended that we do oropharyngeal or nasopharyngeal swabs? Is there any difference, especially thinking about trauma for younger athletes?
I can answer for the collegiate setting. The NCAA is recommending the PCR test. So in most cases, that is the nasal test. And the difference with the PCR is it's molecular, so that it's going to have better accuracy, and even if it's negative. These other tests that are more rapid, they're still very highly accurate if they're positive, but if they're negative, you might have to double check with a molecular test.
So at the high school level, not a lot of testing is being recommended currently, as it's expensive, and there are a ton of high school athletes. It's just not completely accessible to larger communities. So we need to be able to make it accessible to everybody before we can kind of make it mandatory or recommend one over the other.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you for those attending. Our final keynote speech of the day will be beginning in room 1 in about 1 minute. That will be given by Dr. Courtney Gleason, and her speech is entitled Keeping Women in the Game, Female Athlete Attrition and the Benefits of Exercise in Sport. And thank you guys again, everyone, for attending this virtual and being adaptable in this unusual time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.